Now, someone thought it's a good idea to bring American Jews to the Hartman Institute to speak about war. Now, war is a big issue. It used to be a major issue in the pagan world, where the founding myths of creation were myths about wars. Actually, the entire world was created as a result of a war. We are all, can you imagine living in an awareness where we are all a product of the wars of the gods, between the gods? That was World War I, the war that created this world. And the battles between the gods created this world, and then monotheism comes in, the Bible comes in, and tells a story of creation all over again, and erasing the war of foundation from the moment of foundation, offering an alternative beginning to the world. A world that doesn't begin with a war. A world that's not a product of a war. And stripping the war taking the war out of the founding story and creating a story with no war was probably one of the most important moves in the Bible. Because many times in the Bible, the important parts of the Bible are not the parts that are in the Bible, but those that are not in the Bible. And the decision and the understanding that our world is not a product of war is a great understanding and an important understanding, but then comes the next understanding. Monotheism will create the idea that the world will end with a war. It's almost like all we did was shift the location of the founding war. It wasn't there in the beginning of history like the pagans believe. It will be there in the end of history. It's not the war that began everything, it is the war that will end everything, and good luck with that. Meaning it's not something that we remember nostalgically, it's something to look forward to. Now, Mike, and welcome to Israel, where it's going to take place, by the way. Now, having an alternative myth, not a myth of creation, but a myth of the end of history, an eschatological myth, what does that mean? What does that mean, that my description of relocating the war, the Great War? Now, in the Bible, what is the Great War, the war that's going to end history? What is that war called? Armageddon. In Hebrew, what is it called? Megiddo. Now, I think that's not the Hebrew Bible. Right? This is the Revelation to John, where the war that will end all wars and all history will be the war of Armageddon. In the Hebrew Bible, it's the war of, in Ezekiel 38, the war of Gog v'Magog. And I think that will be a nice way to start this morning to study and think about that war. That's all we're going to do today. It's not my fault. You signed up for this. But before we study Ezekiel 38 and the war of Gog and Magog, the war that ends history, according to Ezekiel, I'd like to offer some thoughts about the myth of apocalypse, the understanding and the belief that the world will end in a tremendous war, that everything will collapse into a war, and that's how. And I want to ask why this is. I think the myth of the apocalypse has everything to do with human condition and with human nature. And I'd like to ask, why is it that in Islam and Christianity and in parts of Judaism, this myth developed? What does this myth serve? This belief that history will end, and it will end in a war. An important Israeli historian, Yaakov Talmon, argues that the modern understanding of revolution is a secularization of the myth of the apocalypse. And he reads this into Karl Marx. He makes the following argument. Karl Marx believed that the world could be a better place. It could be a perfect place. There's just one problem. This world can't be a perfect place. The structure of society, the capitalistic structure of society, can't be cured. We can't repair it. We can't change it. Meaning the only way for this world to be cured is for what to happen? For it to completely collapse, be destroyed, and then on the ruins of that world, we can create a perfect world. So capitalism has to collapse for a better world to be created. That is a secularization of a very powerful impulse, the impulse that created the myth of the apocalypse. And it's the following myth. We believe that a great world can be born, but it can't be born out of this world. Therefore, in order for a better world to be created, this world has to be destroyed. See, the myth of the apocalypse is the exact opposite of a different Jewish notion that Americans like to call tikkun olam. Because what does tikkun olam assume? Well, first of all, it assumes we're not living in a perfect world. Why? We have to repair it. It's not perfect. But it's not only pessimistic, it's also optimistic. Why? Because you believe that it could be repaired. Tikkun olam is a healthy, moderate dose of Jewish optimism. It's a belief that this world could be repaired. The apocalypse Judaism is when you stop believing that this world could be repaired. When you are miyuash. When you're in despair, when you don't believe that this world could heal. That this world can change. That the only way to create a better world is not to repair this world, but to destroy it. And the religious expression of this is the myth of the apocalypse. And the secular expression of this intuition is the idea of revolution. The founding fathers of Israel, which were revolutionists, they used to sing, Olam Yashan, Adei Yesod Nachriva. The old world we will destroy till its foundations. The only way to create a better world, a new world, is not to cure this world, but to destroy it. Now that understanding, so I would say, what happens, by the way, if you're a pessimist, but you don't believe in the myth of the apocalypse? Meaning you believe that this world can't be cured, and by the way, it's not going to be destroyed. We're stuck with it. Someone would call that attitude postmodernism. Or at least a postmodern attitude where you understand that a perfect world is not accessible, a better world is not accessible, the apocalypse is not going to go. So I would say an apocalypse, this is what happens when a pessimist becomes a believer. What happens when you add two different attitudes? You believe in redemption and you're a pessimist. If you believe in redemption because of your religious tradition and you're a pessimist, you don't believe that this world can be cured, but the result of these two beliefs is the myth of the apocalypse. This world can't be cured. A better world should be born. The only way it's going to be played out, this world will be destroyed, and on the ruins of this world, a better world, a perfect world, will be created. Now, we like to believe, and I think we have good reasons to believe, that tikkun olam, the belief that this world could be repaired, that even though it has all its weaknesses and all its faults, still we believe in this world. Tikkun olam is a very Jewish notion. And therefore, apocalypse seems, the way I'm trying to read it now, seems like it's challenging our basic Jewish optimism about this, about who we are and where we are. And I'd like to start, I think that in the Bible, in the Torah, in the first 5 books of Moses, for the most part, it's anti-apocalyptic. It might even be an attempt to neutralize the apocalyptic fantasy. The fantasy that there's that the world will collapse, be destroyed, and a better world will replace it. And I think the text that we all know, that was created partially to neutralize this fantasy is the text of the Mabul, the ancient story of the flood. What happens in the story of the flood? Why does that story, how does that challenge the myth of the apocalypse? In a deep sense, if you internalize that story, it neutralizes your ability to develop that fantasy of the end of history, of the world being destroyed and replaced with a better one. How does the story of the Mabul challenge the myth of the apocalypse? What? There's preservation, meaning? But how does the story of the Mabul guarantee continuity, the story of the flood? What? Yeah, well, first of all, and before anything else, right after the flood, God makes a promise to humanity that he'll never destroy the world again. Okay, so now Ezekiel is probably a Talmudist saying when he promised that he'll never destroy the world, he meant by water. He didn't say fire. But I assume that the original meaning of the flood was that God guarantees us the attempt. That doesn't happen anymore. And another thing happens in the story of the flood. It actually makes the bomb of the apocalypse, it neutralizes the bomb by exploding it. Because what is the Mabul? God expresses this human fantasy that everything is screwed up. Vatimalea aretz Hamas. Hamas was a bad word back then. And the only way, and he's in despair, and the only way to create a better world is not to repair this one, to destroy it, and then to create a better world. The entire fantasy of the apocalypse is manifested in the story of the Mabul, and then God destroys the world, builds it again, and guess what? We're the same people. The Mabul is and we continue, we're the same good old or us now. And so actually the story of the Mabul is the story of the failure of the myth, of the fantasy of the apocalypse. It doesn't work. And finally, what the myth of the Mabul does, the myth of the flood does, it locates the dream of the world destroying and being repaired with a different world. It locates it in the beginning of history rather than the end of history. Meaning, for graduates of the Mabul story, the apocalypse is not something that history is going to, it's something that already happened. It's part of our past, not a part of our future. So for these three reasons, I think the myth of the Mabul, by locating in the past, not in the future, proving that the model fails, and finally God promising that will never happen again, the myth of the Mabul is there partially in order to neutralize the fantasy of the apocalypse, maybe trying to cultivate a new attitude towards the world. You want a better world, don't destroy it, repair it. Don't break it. Try to work with it. Now obviously there is a lot of depth to this, because this is everything to do with everything. What do we do with, I'll just give one example. How do we deal with our own psychology? How do we deal with the fact that we have evil voices within us, what Chazal call the Yetzer Hara? Is Yetzer Hara English also, Rabbi? That's English, right? That's Jewish English. Everybody knows maybe there's people here that don't have a Yetzer Hara, but so there is a voice in Chazal that says you have to destroy, you have to squash your Yetzer Hara. You have to fight it, you have to destroy it. And there is a voice within the Talmud, no, you don't. You never destroy anything you have in you. You only work with it. There's a famous story in the Talmud where one of the rabbis is two important scholars, Reish Lakish, which used to be a gangster, and Rabbi Yochanan, one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of Israel. And the story that they meet while Reish Lakish is still a gangster and he's swimming in the water. By the way, skinny dipping. And Rabbi Yochanan looks at him, and Reish Lakish looks at Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan, and the Reish Lakish looks at Rabbi Yochanan and he sees, and he looks at him and he says, Yofyecha nashim, you're so good looking. You should use your looks, and he knows he doesn't, to pursue women. Yofyecha nashim. And Rabbi Yochanan looks at Rabbi Reish Lakish and he sees all his power, and he says to him, Kochecha leTorah, your power is supposed to be channeled to Torah. And as some Hasidic rabbis read this, what didn't Rabbi Yochanan tell Reish Lakish? He didn't tell him all that energy you have that you use to steal and to promote and to destroy the world. All that energy that you have to overcome it in order to return to Torah. That's not what he told him. What did he tell him? That's the energy that will take you to Torah. It's about working with what you have and not against what you have. So this is a very important Jewish idea. And here, this is where I should be careful. Because it's a Jewish idea. The idea that you don't attack the world, you work with the world. It's a Jewish idea. It's probably not the Jewish idea. Within the Bible, we have many, many voices, and the way I'm trying to read the story of the Mabul, it's one voice challenging the fantasy of the apocalypse, and then we have Ezekiel 38, which is not challenging that fantasy, it's fulfilling it. So what I'd like to do now is read Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38 comes right after Ezekiel 37, that's right. And Ezekiel 37 is a famous chapter. It's the chapter of the dry bones. Ezekiel has a vision where he sees in the valley filled with dry bones. And then there's a moment when God tells him that what he's seeing is a metaphor. What do the dry bones resemble? God says to him, that the dry bones are expressing what people are saying today. They're saying, Avda tikvatenu, nigzarnu lanu. Let's translate that into English. We lost our hope. We are doomed. Avda tikvatenu, nigzarnu lanu. Ezekiel didn't know that a few thousand years later, a poet called Naftali Herz Imber will create a song that's the national answer to Ezekiel. Ezekiel says, Avda tikvatenu. We've lost our hope. And he writes a song, Odlo avda tikvatenu. The tikva is a dialogue with Ezekiel's dry bones. The tikva is our answer to those dry bones. The tikva is an answer to the bones that resemble the loss of hope, and we're not saying Odlo avda tikvatenu, which means literally, we didn't lose hope yet. And a cynic would say, well, not yet. Odlo avda tikvatenu. Now, and part of the metaphor is that he sees how the Jewish people resurrects itself, comes back to Israel, and rebuilds the country. That's Ezekiel 37. The end of Ezekiel 37 is even more bold. Not only will the Jews return to Israel, they will also be united. Imagine that. They will also be united. That's Ezekiel 37. And after Ezekiel 37, we move to Ezekiel 38, which might have a very strong connection to the optimism of Ezekiel 37, which is the chapter I want to read. I want to read parts of it, major parts of it now with you. Now here's how I like to read it. I'd like to read it in Hebrew for two reasons. One, I don't know how to read English. And two, I think it was written in Hebrew. So what I would like to ask, feel free to follow me, the English translation, but try to listen to the Hebrew because it's powerful and I think it's also beautiful. Vayhi dvar Adonai elai lemor. I'm in Ezekiel 38, verse 1. Ben Adam, son of man. For some reason, Ezekiel is always called son of man. My friend Rabbi Benny Lau interprets that he's called son of man because he has these great visions. He might forget that he is a human being, so God constantly reminds him the contrast between his visions and his humanity. Ben Adam sim panecha el Gog eretz hamagog nesi rosh meshech vetuval vehinave alav. This is going to be a prophecy about a person called Gog. And Gog is the president or the king of a country called Magog. I admit, when I was young, I always used to think that the war of Gog and Magog is Gog against Magog. It sounded that way. But the war of Gog and Magog is not Gog against Magog. It's the war of Gog, the leader of a country called Magog. ואמרת עליו, כה אמר אדוני, in verse 3, אדוני אלוהים, הנני עליך גוג נשיא, ראש משך ותובל, ושובבתיך. I'm in verse 4 now. ונתתי חכים בלחייך, והוצאתי אותך, ואת כל חיליך, סוסים ופרשים, לבושי מכלול כולם, קהל רב, צינה מגן, תופסי חרבות, כולם. He's telling Gog, I'm going to take you out. And you're going to be armed with, I guess, the best way to think about this is the best weapons of your age and your time. And he continues, Paras, I'm in verse 5, Kush, Ufut, Itam, Kulam, Magen, Vachova. Other nations will join Magog, preparing militarily for something very big that's going to happen. Gomer v'chol agapea. I'm in verse 6 now. Beit Torgema v'chol agapea. Yarkatek Tzafon v'chol agapav. He's continued to describe nations, great nations, strong nations that will join the coalition of nations of Magog, led by Gog. Now he says two words in Hebrew which are important words. I'd like you to listen to these words in Hebrew. Amim Rabim Itach. These two words, Amim Rabim, are going to appear again and again throughout this chapter. Martin Buber taught us that if a certain word appears too many times, what does that mean? That word might be the dominant word, might be the key to the secret of this chapter. So I'd like to notice the two words, Amim Rabim. Many nations. Amim Rabim. He's describing how Amim Rabim, many nations, will join Magog, led by Gog, in this great war. Hikon, והכן לך אתה וכל קהליך והנקלים עליך והיית להם למשמר. The war didn't begin yet. What is he describing here in his vision? These are the moments of preparation. They're preparing the army. They're organizing the people. And והיית להם למשמר. After you organize them, so you have to guard them and help them wait for their moment. מימים רבים תיפקד באחרית השנים. Finally, we have a date. When will this war burst out? אחרית השנים. Which means in the end of the years. Now this competes with there's another way to say this in biblical Hebrew, which will appear 2 more times in this chapter, which will also become a dominant word in this chapter. Not acharit hayamim, but not acharit hashanim, but acharit hayamim. Acharit hayamim. The end, I guess you realize that the end of days and the end of years is the same date. When the days end, when the years end, it's the end. It's the biblical way to say the end of time. The Greeks call this eschaton, the end of history, the end of time. So we know who is going to be involved in this. Amim Rabim, many people, many nations. And we also know when in the end of time, in Acharit Hashanim or Acharit Hayemim. Okay? I'm still in verse 8. מימים רבים תיפקד באחרית השנים תבוא אל ארץ משובבת מחרב מקובצת מעמים רבים. Magog will lead all these nations to a land where the people in that land are people that came out of, from where? They all came, hitkabtsu, they all left to Israel from where? From many nations, from Amim Rabim. So you're starting to notice the structure here is that the people of Israel will leave Amim Rabim to Israel. That was Ezekiel 37. And after they leave Amim Rabim, what's Ezekiel 38 about? Those Amim Rabim also coming to Israel. So the end of history has two stages. Stage one, the Jews leaving many nations and coming to Israel. And stage two, many nations chasing them back to Israel. והיא מקובצת מעמים רבים על ערי ישראל אשר הייתה לחרבה תמיד. והיא מעמים הוצאה. These people, again, he repeats himself, just left the nations. וישבו לבטח כולם. ישבו לבטח כולם means, what does it mean? That they will dwell in safety, all of them. That this is a stage of history that they feel that they're guarded, that they're safe, that they have achieved peace. Creating one of the paradoxes of Ezekiel, when will the great war begin? After the people will believe that they've achieved peace. Maybe that's why we call this peace and war. According to Ezekiel, it's that peace that's the setting for the great big war. And I'm moving to verse number 9. And this is a verse I think it's much better to read in Hebrew. Ve'alita kesho'a tavo, ke'ana lechasot ha'aretz. Magog will come like what? And now here is an impossible word to the 21st century Jew. Okay, he said the S word. He said that word. Now you understand that he didn't mean all the connotations that we have, that word. Actually, Shoah just means a big cloud, a quick cloud. But in 1943 in Israel, when they started hearing what's happening in Europe, realizing it's probably more than a mega pogrom, realizing the horrifying things happening in Europe, and they wanted to describe it, they took this word from this chapter and from this verse to describe what's happening there. Meaning they try to give what's happening in Europe the Ezekiel connotation by calling that the Shoah. That's, by the way, a very bold move, because that's trying to say that what's happening in Europe is what? It is the end of days. It's trying to give meaning to all that's happening. It's trying to give it messianic meaning. It's trying to say it's not for nothing. But by the way, what happened with the word and the history of language is so interesting, is that it's not that, what was happening there is so horrifying, is that when they took this word to describe what's happening there, I don't know if it lent what happened in Europe, the connotation of Ezekiel. I think what's happening today is the exact opposite. We read Ezekiel and we bump into this word, and what does that remind us of? What happened there? It's the events in Europe giving meaning to Ezekiel, and not the word of Ezekiel lending a connotation to what happened in Europe. By the way, also English tried to give it religious meaning, what happened in Europe, calling it Holocaust, trying to say it's a religious, it's like Holocaust is a sacrifice you offer God. Not very successful terms, but today that's all we have. And then he continues, you'll come like a big cloud to conquer Israel. Ata v'chol agapecha, I'm still in verse 9. Ve'amim rabim otach. You will come, you, and then again he says it. Ve'amim rabim otach. You and many nations, many people. Ko amar Adonai Elohim. I'm in verse 10 now. V'aya bayom ha'u ya'alu dvarim al levavecha v'chashavta machshevet ra. Now he's describing the inner conversation that Gog has with himself. I'm moving to verse 11. This is the monologue of Gog to himself. Ve'amarta e'ele al eretz prazot. Avoa shoktim yoshvei levetach. Kulam yoshvim be'ein choma uvariach. Ve'daltaim en lahem. I will go to Israel. And why is he seduced to come to Israel? Because what is the political conditions in Israel in these days? Safety. No walls around their cities. Kulam yoshvim be'ein choma. No walls. Meaning, very serious. This is the fantasy of Yair Lapid. Meaning, cutting the budget of security completely. No more need for security budgets. No more walls. No more army. This is it. Smaller classrooms. But this is the conversation in Israel today. Can we cut the security budget, invest more in smaller classrooms, or can't we? Ezekiel says, one day we'll have such a strong sense of security, we will do that. No more walls, no more army. We'll be yoshvim labetach. We will sit in safety. V'daltaim en lahem. There is no walls, therefore there is no doors. Everything is open. And when the walls will be torn down, when the gates will be open, no, the gates won't be open. They won't exist to begin with. When we feel so safe and so guarded because we believe that there is no more war, well, that's when the war will begin. And he describes the temptation. So let's try to stop here for a minute and to describe the three stages towards the end of history, just so we could know where we are located today. Stage 1, Ezekiel 37, the people of Israel come to the land of Israel. Stage 2, they achieve peace in the land of Israel. Stage 3, the nations they came from will come to them to try to destroy them. Kibbutz Galiot, the gathering of the exiles, peace, and then war. I think that's the structure of the end of history according to these verses in Ezekiel. I'm skipping to verse 14. לכן הנבא בן אדם ואמרת לגוג כה אמר אדוני אלוהים ביום ההוא בשבט עמי ישראל לבטח תדע. Now Ezekiel's going to repeat himself again. And I guess there might be a meaning from repeating himself, trying to amplify the dominant motifs here. ובאת ממקומך מירכתי צפונם, in verse 15. ועמים רבים איתך. You and, we hear it again, the many nations. רוכבי סוסים, כולם, קהל גדול וחיל רב. ועלית על עמי ישראל, I'm in verse 16 now. כענן לכסות ארץ, באחרית הימים תהיה. We see the second motive, not who, but the timing, but when. When? The aschoton, באחרית הימים, in the end of days תהיה. והביאותיך על ארצי למען דעת הגויים אותי בקדשי בך לעיניהם גוג. And then he continues, כה אמר אדוני אלוהים, האתה הוא אשר דיברתי, I'm in verse 17 now, בימים קדמונים ביד עבדי נביאי ישראל הניבאים בימים ההם שנים להביא אותך עליהם. I'm in verse 18 now. והיה ביום ההוא ביום בו גוג על אדמת ישראל נאום אדוני אלוהים תעלה חמתי באפי ובקנאתי. I'm in verse 19 now. ובקנאתי באש עברתי דיברתי אם לא ביום ההוא יהיה רעש גדול על אדמת ישראל. What happens once Gog and his many nations come to Israel? God gets angry, and what does he do? His anger is now channeled towards Gog and all these great nations. And it will start with an earthquake, I think I'll stop reading now. I'll start describing because there's a lot more to read here. And after the earthquake, fire will come from the sky and destroy and burn all those amim rabim, all those many nations. Let's just taste this in verse 22. ונשפטתי איתו בדבר, בדם וגשם שוטף ואבני על גביש, אש וגופרית אמתין עליו ועל אגפיו ועל עמים רבים אשר איתו. So what's the final moment of history? Where all these nations will come to Israel, but it will be a trap. It will be a trap. They'll all be here, and then God's fire will come out of the sky and burn them all. And by the way, then we have a very big problem, which chapter 39 deals with. I won't go into because it's already too many, very graphic. Now what problem do we have after God killed all the nations in Israel? Now the Israelis are here stuck with what? And now what do the Israelis have to do? Now they have to bury them. Now all of Israel is one big chevre kadisha. Now we all have to bury, I guess, with a big tomb saying, here is buried mankind, or amim rabim. And after that burial ceremony, we will know that the Lord is God, and He is holy, and we are chosen. History ends. The end. Isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? Yes, I heard Rabbi West saying every Sukkot, the rabbi has to give a sermon, and this is the material he has to use. Yeah, everyone will die, and Shabbat Shalom. Now, what do you do with this material? What can you do with this material? What can you do with this understanding that in the pagan world, it was the world began between a war between the gods, and according to Ezekiel, the history will end with a war. It will also be a war of God, but not a God against gods, but a God against humanity. God against the many people, amim rabim. That's how history will end. This is it. Then it will really end. Then the world will be repaired from war, and this is it. Now, what do we do with this? The truth is, what I don't want to do now is offer a creative reading in Ezekiel that proved that he was a hidden liberal and humanist. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I actually want to listen to Ezekiel. He's actually saying something, and I want to give weight to what he is saying. And then to notice that Ezekiel is not the only prophet in the Bible, and he's not the only person that heard God talk, and he is not the only one that had a vision of the end of history. There was another prophet that had a very clear vision of how history will end, and that prophet was called Isaiah. What I'd like to do now is to read the end of history according to Isaiah and try to figure out the disagreement between Ezekiel and Isaiah about this big question: how will history end? You have Isaiah chapter 2, verse 1. You have it all? Great. הדבר אשר חזה ישעיהו בן אמוץ על יהודה וירושלים. This is the vision that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And in verse 2, we could already understand what the vision, when the vision is taking place. V'haya be'acharit hayamim. In the end of days. This is Isaiah's eschatology. This is Isaiah's attempt to see how everything will end. V'haya be'acharit hayamim. Nachon yehar beit Adonai בראש ההרים, ונישא מגבעות, ונהרו אליו כל הגויים. The Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and that mountaintop will be above all the hills. First of all, I want to notice that anyone that was ever in Temple Mountain knows if you stand there, you look around, you're in a mountain, in a hill that's lower than all the hills that are around you. So how can we understand Isaiah? Temple Mount is the lowest mountain, but in the end of days, it will be the highest mountain. It will be a very high monument. So how can we understand? I think the only way to understand this, he's obviously speaking metaphorically. He's saying we should imagine for 1 minute Jerusalem not as the lowest mountain, but the highest mountain, in a high. And what will this monument do, this very high monument? V'naharu elav kol hagoyim. All the nations will come there and surround it. Now, I don't know about you, but it sounds like a deja vu. What's the deja vu, the biblical deja vu? A very high monument and having humanity around it. Well, it could remind you of Sinai, a high hill and a mountain, and the people around it. But now think of a different monument where humanity is concentrated around it. What does it remind you of? Babel. What was the purpose of the Babylonian tower of Migdal Babel? They said, "Na'aseh lanu ir u'migdal ve'rosho b'shamayim v'na'aseh lanu shem ben nafutz al pnei kol haaretz," meaning we'll create a city and a tower that will reach the sky, but the purpose is not to reach the sky. The real purpose is that it won't be scattered over the land. One great monument that we will all be concentrated around, that will unify us. It seems like Babel, the city of the beginning of days, is an interesting dialogue with Jerusalem, the city of the end of days. Jerusalem, the city of the end of days, will somehow bring humanity together around a big hill, a big mountain, a gigantic monument, just like Babylon, the city of the beginning of days, did the same thing. Now, is Jerusalem a repetition of Babylon, or is it an attempt to repair the story of Babylon? The story of Babylon was about a great monument that concentrated humanity, an attempt to control humanity. I don't know if Jerusalem will be about power, and if it's going to be about control. Because as we'll see pretty soon, according to Isaiah, what will unite humanity is not Jewish power, but Jewish wisdom. It won't be about control, it will be about Torah. It will be about inspiration. It will be about something else. It seems like... Okay. V'naharu elav kol hagoyim. By the way, this term in the end of verse 2, and all the nations shall flow onto it. V'naharu elav kol hagoyim. Hebrew here is very, very deep. Naharu, where humanity will flow towards this great mountain. Naharu in Hebrew comes from what word? Nahar. What is nahar? A river. They will flow like a river, but there's a problem here. Rivers usually come from the mountains down. Here, the river is going against the flow. V'naharu elav. It was a river that will be a reverse river climbing up a mountain. I'm in verse 3 now. Ve'halchu amim rabim. And many nations will come to Jerusalem. Ve'amru, and they will say to themselves, Lechu ve'na'ale el har Adonai el beit Elohi Yaakov. Let's go to the hill of God, to the house of the gods of Israel, of Jacob. Ve'yorenu midrachav ve'nelcha me'ochotav. So we will learn there his ways. We'll learn there how to behave. Ki mitzion teitzeh Torah. Because from Zion, Torah will come. Udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. The words of God will come from Jerusalem. So Amim Rabim are coming to Israel to learn the word of God. And now in verse 4, he's going to tell us what are those words of God. V'shafat ben hagoyim, ve'ochiach le'umim rabim. Somehow reconcile tensions between nations. And after you reconcile the tensions between nations, that will lead to v'chitetu charbotam le'itim. They will take their swords and turn them into, how do you say? Plows, thank you. They will take their, and v'chanitotehem lemazmerot, and as a result of them destroying their weapons, there will be no weapons, and there will be no more war. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev, lo ilmedu od milchama. That's the end of history. What is the end of history according to Isaiah? The end of history according to Isaiah is not, history won't end in a big war. The end of history will end the age of war. By the way, who's right about the end of history? Ezekiel or Isaiah? I want to think about this again. It seems like there's a very strong resemblance between the end of history according to Ezekiel and the end of history according to Isaiah. They both have the following vision. Be'acharit hayamim, in the end of days, amim rabim, many nations, where will they all concentrate, all come? They will all come to Israel. They have the same image of how history is supposed to end, and just in case we missed it, the resemblance, they're using the same words. It's my understanding in the Bible, stories are similar and words are repeated, not in order to show how things are similar, but to show how things are different. Because cognitively speaking, it's very hard for human beings to notice the differences between things that are different. I'm sure no one there is sitting there and saying, wow, the bottle of water is so different than the microphone. It's just so different. I mean, this is... I'm sure you're not doing that. Wow, did you notice how different it is? But if I'd have two microphones here, and they were very, very similar, then you would notice the difference. Only when paradoxically, things need to be similar in order for us to notice the difference and to think about the difference. The Bible tells things all over again, not in order to say, wow, look how things appear all over again. Not in order to celebrate how things are similar, but in order to emphasize the difference. The end of it, the history ends twice in the Bible, but the same structure. In Acharit Hayamim, Amim Rabim will come to Eretz Israel. They're telling the same story all over again. But they're telling the same story all over again, not to show how similar it is, but to emphasize how different it is. According to Ezekiel, Amim Rabim and Acharit Hayamim will come to Israel in order to fight a great war. According to Isaiah, Amim Rabim and Acharit Hayamim will come to Israel in order to learn that there is no more war. Lo yisa goy el goy cherev. Now I'd like to think about what we've tried to establish here, that the Bible creates a disagreement that we're supposed to notice between Isaiah and Ezekiel. It's not a small disagreement, it's a great disagreement. It's a disagreement about how history is going to end. How does it end? Isaiah has one vision, Ezekiel has another vision. Now, if I was a biblical scholar, this is what I would have said. No, sometimes biblical scholars have interesting things to say. And this is what I would say. I said, well, Isaiah writes this at least 140 years before Ezekiel. So he writes his vision of history, of the end of history. And then Ezekiel uses all its material to write an alternative end to history. What Ezekiel is It's a midrash on Isaiah. Isaiah has this naive, peace and love, end of history. Echarita yamim, amim rabim will come to Israel to end war. And Isaiah, as a cynical interpreter Ezekiel, as a cynical interpreter of Isaiah, he says, yeah, that's right. In Acharita Yamim, Amim Rabim will come to Israel, but not in order to end war. When they will come, it will be for the big war. So what Ezekiel is doing, he is using the materials of Isaiah in order to flip the message, to turn around the message of Isaiah. Why would Ezekiel do that? Is it possible that Ezekiel is less naive because what he went through in life? Is it possible Ezekiel doesn't believe in the possibility of all the Gentiles coming to Israel to learn from us about peace? Is it possible that Ezekiel is a cynical reader of Isaiah? Is that possible? Well, that's what I would have said if I was a biblical scholar. But I'm not. And I want to read the Bible the way that I think the Bible asked us to read. For some reason, the Bible, whoever canonized the Bible, gave us Jewish history a book that has both Isaiah and Ezekiel, and for some reason, the Bible offers us two alternative endings to history. The Bible is not only a pluralistic book, it creates a pluralism of endings. There's different ways that history could end. There's the Isaiah way for it to end, and there's the Ezekiel way of it to end. And it's my sense when I think about the Bible, that the Bible is kind of like, I don't know if they probably still have those kind of books, but a very powerful memory I have from my childhood. My mom's from Oklahoma, so I don't know if they do this only in Oklahoma. We used to have these books where you could choose your own ending. If you want the prince to kiss her, you move to page 19. You still have that? You still have it. It's not just something weird that I used to have. I always wanted the same ending. Don't change the ending. But so you have and though you choose, since you have many alternative endings, what does that mean? That the reader could choose its ending. I think this is the power of a pluralism of endings. I think what the Bible is trying to say. History could end in different ways. Choose your ending. Choose how you think history should end. By the way, I must say, Isaiah and Ezekiel are not the only endings that the Bible offers. Zechariah has another ending. The book of Daniel has another ending. The reason there is a pluralism of endings, the reason why I chose Isaiah and Ezekiel is these are two endings that are aware of each other and in a dialogue with each other. The same structure, the same words, but reverse endings. This might be a very important motif in the Bible. But before I make one more reflection, I think this is probably time for me to stop talking and open the conversation, and then I'll say some concluding remarks. Rabbi.
David, I've always wondered why in verse 23 of the Ezekiel chapter 38, you have those words, Yitkadalti v'yitkadashti, which I assume is where we get Yitkadal v'yitkadash. We all know Yitkadal v'yitkadash as such a meaningful prayer, and it comes from this very grim context. Can you talk about that?
Where is that?
It's on page 8. Page 8, verse 23.
Yeah, there's a lot of tension in this verse. V'itgadalti v'itgadashti v'nodati le'enei goim rabim. Meaning God is going to show his power to many nations. But the thing is, those nations are not going to carry the word of God. Why? Because right after they see his power, what's going to happen? They're dead. That's kind of counterproductive. To show someone your power by killing him. Bruise him. Let him tell everyone else. This is the same paradox we find in Exodus. In Exodus, the entire Exodus, 5 times it says that in Exodus, the Egyptians will know that God is their Lord. Hashem wa Elohim. And when does that happen? The moment when they realize that God is the Lord, when they are in Yam Suf, the ocean is about to close on them, and then suddenly they realize that God is the Lord. They have 1 second, that's it. So it seems like God is not educating the world through the Egyptians. It's counterproductive. So, Rabbi, I don't really know how this works. Yes.
Another way of
Man.
upholding these two, rather than either or,
Yeah.
is both.
Uh-huh.
Is that the Isaiah seems a little bit naive to me.
Okay.
I feel like it's going to happen.
Okay.
Whereas the cost is very great for Ezekiel. And it may be that the cost or the struggle that Ezekiel talks about, the death, the destruction of inner habits, for example, is necessary for that which is already there to manifest itself.
You're saying Ezekiel in some way leads to Isaiah. We have to go through the struggle in order to find the struggle of Ezekiel to find the harmony of Isaiah.
Something may have to die for something new to be born.
Yes.
Matthew may just have answered this. The folks today who talk often about the coming of the Messiah, who talk about the end days, what emotional needs do you think it grants?
I think when people argue about the future, it's never about the future. I'll repeat it by answering it. I'm interpreting the question now. I think when people argue about the future, so they never argue about the future, it's always about the present. We argue about we use the future in order to disguise our disagreements about the present. Let's think about this a little bit more. Obviously, when Isaiah is speaking about how he thinks history should end, he's saying something about how Israel should look like today. If the goal of history is for us to inspire the world with Torah, and through that Torah to being preached to this world, if that's the end of history, so I think we could know what Isaiah thinks about what kind of an Israel should we create today. And if according to Ezekiel, the end of history is a manifestation of a fantasy of finally all the goyim being destroyed in Israel by our God's power, I think he's not telling us something about our future, but what he thinks about how we should create our present. What is the Israel? How do we create an Israel in light of the Ezekiel vision? And how do we create an Israel in light of the Isaiah vision? I think it's always a disagreement about the present, about what kind of a present should we create in light of your vision of the future. By the way, the myth, the apocalypse, the notion that the world is going to be destroyed, we always, in every day and age, there's always a belief that this time it's for real, that this time history is going to end. As we're talking, there's two competing apocalyptic myths in Western civilization that many of us believe in. One is the ecological apocalyptic myth, that very soon, guess what? The karchonim, the icebergs are going to melt, and finally, people from Jerusalem won't have to drive all the way to Tel Aviv to see the ocean. You know, global warming, there is that, and there's a lot of anxiety there, maybe, world as we know, and there is another set of anxiety. Iran is going to acquire a bomb and give that bomb to terrorist organizations. Now, the right has its own myth, and the left has its own myth. Now, but if you realize that the disagreements between right and left today in Western civilization, what's going to bring the end of history, it's less an argument about the future, it's definitely an argument about the present. Because if the threat is Islamic fundamentalism, we have to create certain type of countries. And if the threat is ecological, so we have to not reinforce nation states, but the UN, and to try to maybe overcome the nation state structure. Our fears about the future are always an expression of our belief about the present, but what kind of a world we want to create. Tell me, let me try to make this simple. Tell me how you think the world is going to end, and that tells me a lot about what kind of a world you want to create. If you ask the Israeli right, why is Israel in danger and it might be Israel is always on the verge of destruction. But according to the Israeli left, because we're too strong, and according to the Israeli right, it's because we're too weak. Now, are we sharing our fears about the future, our visions for that future, but our present? So our conversation about the future is an important conversation once we realize it's a disguise for what we think about what kind of a Israel we want to create today. The disagreement between Isaiah and Ezekiel is a powerful disagreement. I hope I answered your question. Thank you. Yes?
If the world is at peace and swords are beat into plowshares, why should it be the end of days? Why isn't there a continuation after that? How are we supposed to understand the word, the end of days or the end of history?
Well, maybe a nice way to think about it, the way Hegel says, it's the end of history as we know it. It's the end of history. Everything we know about history, let's just be a Marxist just for 1 minute. That the struggle between classes is the reason for religion, it's the reason for nationalism, it's the reason for wars, it's the reason for everything. Therefore, once we resolve that, everything will be resolved, and all the laws of history will change, we'll enter a new era that we can't even recognize. That's the way to think about it. We're entering a whole new world it's a different cosmos. It's not what we know. It's a different age. And it's separated, it's divorced from everything that we could, that seems similar to us. Yes?
This is very fascinating to hear you compare the two of these in terms of the end of days, without much talk about resurrection, the idea of resurrection in Jewish religious thought.
Resurrection of it.
In fact, there's a book called The Death of Death, which maybe you're familiar with, which talks about the centrality of resurrection for Jewish religious thought. But I was hoping that you could help me figure out some way to take what Isaiah and Ezekiel wrote and somehow transform it into today's modern world. So assume that you are Netanyahu and you are reading Ezekiel. Would you say to us, Jews, don't come to Israel. Stay where you are. Keep the nations away from Israel, because so long as you are there in the United States or Australia or France or Germany, you will keep them all from invading us at one time. But Isaiah says, aha, Netanyahu, as soon as Jerusalem is recognized as the capital of Israel, all the nations of the world will come to us and surround Jerusalem with their embassies, and all the people of the world will be around Jerusalem, and we will have some form of peace. Does that make any sense? Mr. Prime Minister?
Addressing your first question, resurrection is not a part of the Bible. Besides one sentence in the book of Daniel, which is enigmatic to begin with, resurrection is not a part of the Bible. We don't find, in Ezekiel 37, there is an image where dead people wake up and start walking, but then God says, by the way, that's a metaphor. And Rav Yehuda in the Talmud, in the Babylonian Talmud, in Traktat Sanhedrin said, somebody says in the Talmud, he said, Metim shechya Yechezkel, the dead that Ezekiel resurrected, kamu, amru shira, sang a song. What an image, by the way. They sang a song, and they died again. And Rav Yehuda answers, he says, but it was just how could they sing a song? It's just a metaphor. So if there's a recognition, so in Ezekiel, there's only one. So the resurrection is not a part of the Bible. It was injected into Judaism later on. It's a very important understanding for Christianity, obviously. Without resurrection, it's very hard to create the Christian story. But so resurrection is not a part of. So Ezekiel and Isaiah don't have resurrection because in the Bible it's not a dominant story, part of the eschaton. And about Netanyahu, well, I don't think he'll take my advice anyway. Okay. But I would say, what is your impulse? What's your intuition when it comes to our relationship with the Gentiles? Is it about me being feeling threatened by them? And when you're threatened by someone, you have a fantasy of finally defeating them? Or is it about a sense that I have what to offer them? I have what to offer them. And I have a fantasy, a generous world where I can offer what I have to them. Is that me defeating them or inspiring them? That would be two different Israels, two different relationships. Personally, ask me personally, I think Israel is threatened. And I don't think it's a paranoia of Netanyahu that we're threatened. At the same time, I think we have a lot to offer. And I think there's a lot that we can do in order to build a new relationship with the world founded not on threats but on inspiration. So personally, I think obviously that both Ezekiel and Isaiah are expressing something very, very deep within our condition. Yes?
Ezekiel seems to be a retelling of a failed strategy. God will exercise his power, will show his great power, and thus the Jewish people will follow him. That's the Exodus story.
Yep.
He did it once, it didn't work. Why does Ezekiel expect it's going to happen again? Then it'll work the second time.
I don't know. This time it will work. Yeah.
You mentioned how important it is that the timing of what we look at is really, even though we're transposing it to the future, we're really taking it into the context of the time. Can you explain where Isaiah was when he wrote his synopsis, as well as where Ezekiel was, to give it some context as to what was happening at the time?
I don't know how old Isaiah was when he writes this, but it's in the time. But it seems like Isaiah was one of the prophets that was closest to the monarchy. He was part of the elite. He wasn't like Jeremiah, a person that was excommunicated. He was actually part of the elite, part of the king, connected to the king Chizkiyahu. And King Chizkiyahu was the king that managed not only to expand Israel, but also to achieve great relationships with our neighbors, also to build a powerful Jerusalem. And he is the king that in his times, the armies of Assyria came to Israel, surrounded Jerusalem. There was a siege. Jerusalem was about to be destroyed. And then for some reason, they packed their bags and they went back to Assyria. So he was a witness to a moment of peace. He was a witness to a moment where Jerusalem was supposed to be destroyed, and it didn't. Ezekiel, on the contrary, wasn't a witness to a moment of peace. He was a witness to the moment of destruction. So if I was a biblical scholar, I would try to read Ezekiel into the context of his time and say, well, people that are witness to moments of destruction have a pessimistic vision of history. Isaiah was a witness to a miraculous moment. He has an optimistic vision of history. But the interesting thing is that the Bible didn't tell us what was Ezekiel's historical and psychological condition when he said what he said. And it didn't tell us where and how Isaiah felt when he said what he said, because I think the Bible is trying to strip the prophets from the biography of the prophets, trying to take these words said in a certain context, strip it from its context, and give it an eternal meaning. Because, and here I am a student of Maimonides, saying that the Bible is an important text, not because it's accurate, not because it's historic. It's very possible many interpreters of Genesis say that, many interpreters of Maimonides, say that Maimonides didn't think that the story of the Garden of Eden really happened. It didn't really happen, and that's why Maimonides says it's a true story. It's true because it didn't happen. Do you understand this paradox? Because if the reason why the Bible is describing Adam and Eve with a bathing suit in Africa, so it's just a story about them. But if it didn't happen, if it's a parable, it's a story about us. If it's historic, it's about something that happened. If it's a metaphor, it's about something that happens. So I think the Bible is trying to strip its stories from its academic, from its historic context in order to make it about us and not about them. So it's possible that Isaiah was an optimistic because of what he saw in his times. But his optimism is something that we could all link into in certain moments in our lives. And it's possible that Ezekiel was a pessimist because of his own story, but his optimism is not, his pessimism is not his pessimism, it's also our pessimism.
So just a more basic question, rather than talking about the differences with the stories of the prophets at the end of days, what motivated the prophets to even write or think about the end of days, and why should they be writing those kinds of stories? What's the motivation?
Interesting, for example, the Talmud thinks we shouldn't speculate about the end of days. Ain lo ra'ata Elohim zulatecha. We shouldn't speculate on the end of days. But human curiosity is a part of human condition, and and here maybe I'll use your remarks to try to offer a larger observation about this. What the Bible does is almost not fair, because it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. What it's supposed to do is just to offer us a clear vision of the future. Because when you have a clear vision of the future, at least we know where we're going, and the anxiety that comes from no certainty vanishes. And that's what religion is supposed to do. If you ask Spinoza says, what does religion do? Why is it that wherever we see human beings, we have religions? Wherever you have human beings, you have gods. And Spinoza makes offers the following explanation. He says, well, human beings know two things that create constant anxiety. One, we know that there is a future. Meaning animals, he argues, have no future because their mind is always in the present. Human beings have this ability not to locate their minds in their present. Actually, it's very hard for human beings to locate their minds in the present, because while you're here, you're thinking, well, what am I going to do? You're always your mind is not where you are. It slips to the future all the time. But that's only one thing that we know that creates anxiety. The second thing that's attached to it is not only that we know that there is a future, we also know that we don't know that future. Now, these two understandings, that there is a future and that we don't know it, Spinoza says this is the reason for human anxiety, because we all know that anything could happen at any moment. Now, that is a terrifying thought. Good luck, by the way. That is a terrifying thought. And that thought, that anxiety, is what enables religion to grow, says Spinoza in his cynical remark. He says, what does religion offer you? It offers you a sense of certainty. It tells you, well, there is a future, but that future is controllable. There are certain rituals that if you perform, those rituals give you control. and it erases the lack of certainty. Therefore, religion is there because it taps into most basic human anxiety. So that's a Spinoza theory. There's only one problem with the Spinoza theory. You open the Bible is supposed to give me certainty about the future. There's only one problem. He gives me Ezekiel's future. He gives me Isaiah's future. I came to the Bible with a question, searching for an answer, and all I got was another question. It didn't give me certainty. So in that sense, the Bible is not behaving the way the Bible is expected by people like Spinoza to behave. So I would say, why are they speculating about the future? Because human beings want to somehow have a clear understanding of where we're going, because it quiets our basic anxiety. Maybe that's what led Isaiah here. Maybe that's what led Ezekiel here. And then whoever canonized them both, put them both into the Bible, taking those prophecies that neutralize our anxiety, putting them together, and therefore creating all that anxiety all over again. The Bible is about an open future. There is in one of the Christian Apocalypse, Christ is asked, when will all this happen? When will this happen? The vision of Armageddon. And he has a great answer. He said, it already happened. It already did. Meaning, it already did. Metaphysically speaking, it happened. Now, what is history? It's only a manifestation of what's supposed to happen anyway. It already happened. It's doomed to happen. But what does the Bible do? By offering us a pluralism of endings. It could end that way, or that way, or that way. It's saying history is still open. We're not controlled by our destiny. We are the creators of our destiny. By offering a pluralism of endings, it's shifting the power from the people with a vision to the people that read those visions. What's our time condition? Thank you. Right, 6 minutes. Okay, yes.
A more powerful argument for religion be not that it tells us what the future is going to be, but rather it gives us a tool for dealing with an unknowable future, so that it gives us a way of acting and being in a world where we don't know what the future is, but it gives us a way of meeting it.
Yes, that's my understanding of religion. I think every religion has two levels. I'll be judgmental now. We live in a day and age where you're not allowed to be judgmental. So please forgive me for saying something judgmentally, okay? Are you okay with it? Religion in its worst version gives us all an illusion of control. Religion at its best enables us to accept our lack of control. That's religion at its best. And I think Judaism at its best enables us to recognize a lack of control and accept it. Judaism at its worst, in the worst form, gives you illusions of control. A good example would be the difference between Harav Dov Lior, the rabbi of Kiryat Arba, and the mothers of the three boys that were kidnapped. One of the mothers of the three, Rav Dov Lior has certainty. He knows exactly why they were kidnapped. You know why they were kidnapped? He knows why, which is so impressive. So impressive. He knows why they were kidnapped. They were kidnapped because of the attempt of some MKs to promote new legislation about conversion. That he knows why they were kidnapped, which is so impressive. Yeah, it was a big issue for God. So God, we're promoting legislation about that reforming the laws of conversion, so these three boys were kidnapped. Harav Dov Lior knows why, which is very impressive. This is a religion that offers certainty. This is a religion at its worst. The three mothers of the three boys, one of them comes out in the kotel, telling people, everybody's saying Tehillim, knowing that the whole world is praying that these three boys will come back home, and she says, please pray for us. Pray for our boys. light candles for our boys. But don't forget, God doesn't work for us. This is a mother saying that. God doesn't work for us. We're praying, but prayer is not a form of control. And it doesn't give us certainty. Now see the difference between, what's happening in Israel now, today. For example, it triggered the worst of religion and the most noble forms of religion. So, when it comes to the apocalypse, if we have one vision of apocalypse, it gives us certainty. When we have multiple visions of the end of history, maybe it's trying to train our minds to accept lack of certainty. Let's have one last question. I don't know how to do this. Okay. Adriana.
What is Islam's vision of the end of the world, or what is the Islamic approach to Isaiah and Ezekiel?
I'd rather not speak about Islam's approach towards the end of history, because but there is a difference between there's different parts in Islam, the way Sunnis see it, the way Shiites see it. But that's not what I do, Islam. And I think it probably won't be the right way to end this nice morning with us. Okay. So I'll take one other question. Yes, please.
Story of end of days in Torah that is not told, which is when Jacob is
Yeah.
about to die.
Yeah.
For the son. He's going to tell what is going to happen, but it's never told that.
That's right.
So one view could be putting in is what you say, multiple endings, and it's up to Israel to choose what the end will be. I don't know if there is anything in the Talmud about that. What is said.
Yes, I want to end with, this is a good way to think about how to end this. Jacob gathers his sons around. He's going to tell them the secret of the end of days, and then he doesn't. And he keeps us all with a question mark. And an interpreter is saying, why didn't he share with them the secret of the end of days? According to the Talmud, it's supposed to stay a secret. One of the interesting things about Jewish tradition is about what we don't do. And in the Bible, we don't have the stories of the wars that created the world. And we have a pluralism of possibilities of how the world ends. So we don't really know what happened here before we came along, before the world was created. And we don't really know how the world will end. All we know is the world that we live in. And the Bible and all this, I think, is trying to pave the way for a new understanding, a new attitude between human beings, between Jews and the world. It's not about speculating of how it was created and now about fantasizing of how it will end, but what kind of a world can we make out of it? And I want to end where we began. The Bible has no apocalypse. The first 5 books of Moses have no apocalypse. The only apocalypse we have is the story of the Mabul, the story of the flood. And that's not the apocalypse that's going to happen. It's the apocalypse that already happened, and it's the apocalypse that failed. The Bible is saying that the attempt to create a better world through destroying this world, that failed. Maybe paving the way to a different thought. The only way to create a better world is not to give up on this world. But maybe we can make this world, which is obviously not going to be easy, a better place. Thank you. Toda.
Thank you, Micah. Can everybody hear me, or do I need to use the mic? I'll use the mics. So thank you, Micah. Just a couple announcements about this afternoon and Shabbat this evening. Okay, first of all, I've been asked to remind people to please, and I know I'm a terrible exemplar of this right now, to please wear your name tags if you can.